Welcome back to Proxy, everybody, and today we're going to be talking about the Craftworld Eldar Crimson Hunter in 10th edition and if it is good or not. So here's the thing about the Crimson Hunter, it was never really that good, even last edition with the possible combos that you could introduce to it. It was just middling at best, and that was including all the Exarch powers you could give it. And in 10th edition, it is a little bit of a disappointment along with a lot of other flyers in the game. Essentially, the flyer category is something you will rarely see unless they are transports. I know the Imperial Guard Valkyrie is not bad, but there's better options, right? And I think that's the case with most flyers in the game. Yeah, some of them are okay, but there are just always going to be better options, which I think is what GW intended, considering the meta around flyers has been shaky in the past. So, flyers this edition look to be pretty garbage. They have to start from reserve, which is always a disadvantage if you have to do something, right, and you can't have the option of starting them on the board. That's always going to give your opponent a little bit of knowledge about what you're going to try to do. However, there is one thing you can do with the Crimson Hunter. It is pretty cheesy. Not sure if it's intended. It probably definitely isn't intended, but I'm going to tell you guys about it anyway because it looks like they're not going to change it. And we may get an errata on it soon, but we'll just have to hold our breath and see. So without further ado, let us go ahead and jump right into the Crimson Hunter and how to use it in 10th edition. But first, a quick overview of what we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at its stats, weapons, and special rules, its strengths and weaknesses, its combos and synergies, and finally the role Crimson Hunters play in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them in your list. So just looking at its base stats, it's very fast, movement 20 plus, which means it does need to make a minimum move of 20 every single turn, but it is fragile at toughness 8. It has a 3 plus save and a 5 plus invulnerable, which makes it a little bit tougher, but with only wounds 12, it's not going to survive much, and the fact that it can always be seen as a flyer is also pretty problematic. As for its ranged weapons, it's always armed with a pulse laser and either 2 star cannons or 2 bright lances. The bright lances are much better at killing its intended targets with fly. Of course, you can give it star cannons, and now with the changed pulse laser, which it now has 3 shots, you can go heavy infantry hunting, but truthfully, I think the bright lances are just going to be a better buy because of the unparalleled mastery detachment rule, and has much better synergy with Strands of Fate. It pretty much has the same melee profile as our other grav tanks, so there's nothing much change there. It has the Wraithbone Hull, weapon skill 4 plus, which is surprising considering it's a flyer, strength 6, AP 0, damage 1. As for its special ability, it gets +1 to hit and wound against models with a fly keyword. This is actually a pretty solid ability. This means it'll be hitting on 2+ against models with fly base and wounding on probably a 2+ or a 3+ against most targets. If it's going after stuff with fly, not many toughness 12 things out there have fly, so it's probably going to be wounding on a 2+ as well. Or a 3+ with the pulse laser. It does have a damaged profile, which means it's at -1 to hit when at 4 wounds or below. The thing is the Crimson Hunter is never going to be in a position where it's just wounded. Unless your opponent made a serious miscalculation, this thing is very paper thin. So if your opponent shoots it, it will die. So you don't really have to worry about this roll too much. As for its options, it can replace the star cannons with bright lances. This is something you should always do. The bright lances are a much better weapon on this thing. Some people might argue that this thing is good against killing flying infantry, but it's just not efficiently pointed for that role. Flying infantry is typically cheaper than this thing, and this thing wants to kill bigger targets, so you do want to give it the bright lance. And that is because it costs 160 points. It is a very expensive model for the durability it has and the weapons that it carries. It can be taken in a unit of 1, just 1 Crimson Hunter, and yeah, it's pretty expensive. So that's also what kind of sucks about this thing is as a flyer, it doesn't really get a lot of cool special rules. Most of them are just disadvantages. Flyers can't hide. They have to start in reserve. They have to move a minimum distance of 20. So you're going to make yourself more vulnerable. There's a lot of disadvantages to being a flyer, and there's not a whole lot of advantages. So costing 160 points is kind of a bite in the ass. As far as its keywords go, it's an aircraft and it has the fly keyword. Okay, so what are this thing's strengths and weaknesses? So the strengths are it is extremely fast, although this could easily be counted as a weakness if not used properly. Again, you kind of need to focus on where it wants to go the next turn, and because you have to move a minimum of 20 each turn, it's going to put it into range of your opponent's army. So you need to be careful with that. It has solid damage against units with fly. That's the other thing, right? +1 to hit and wound against models with fly is very decent. And if your opponent does have models with fly in their army, this thing can be pretty good against those targets. As far as its weaknesses go, there's a lot of them. It needs to start in reserve, that's one thing. It's very fragile and hard to maneuver, that's the other. It has an expensive point cost for those two weaknesses. It can't hide at all because it's a flyer. And it has no objective control. The other thing about it is that not only can it not hide, but unlike towering units, it actually can't see things that are hidden beyond obscuring terrain. So towering units, the disadvantage goes both ways and is actually also an advantage because they can see over obscuring terrain. That may change in the future, but for now, towering models can see you and you can see them. With flyers, they can see you, but you cannot see them. So it is just basically a huge disadvantage. And lastly, they have no objective control, which is a huge disadvantage. And I realize that most flyers in the game have objective control 0. Actually, all of them do, right? But it still kind of sucks because this is an objective-based game and you need units that can control objectives, and this thing just can't do it. As far as its combos and synergies go, there's something that I actually saw in our Discord, which was mentioned from another channel, Barnyard Gaming. And I guess the Eldar player from that channel uses this strategy. So I did look into it and I want to explain how it works and basically what it is to you guys in just a second. And we'll just call it the Phantasm cheese for now. It is a cheese. It is pretty broken as far as a mechanic goes, and it kind of takes advantage of a rules loophole, which I'll talk about. Shroud Runners are also pretty decent. It can give them lethal hits, although the application is limited, and Vipers can remove cover from enemy units, making them easier to kill. I think Vipers are probably the best synergy with this. Shroud Runners with something with a low amount of high strength, high AP shots, especially with +1 to wound, just isn't going to be that good in general. This thing should be going after flyers, and Shroud Runners should probably be hitting targets that other units in your army will benefit more from. Vipers, though, removing cover does make things harder to kill. A lot of flying units do also like to benefit from cover saves, so that is something. Other than that, though, this thing is really limited in what it can do. You can't really cast Guide on it reliably because you're coming from Strategic Reserve, and because you have to move 20 inches every turn, if you stay on the board, your Farseer is most likely going to be out of range of that when he tries to cast Guide. So there's not a lot in the way of synergy with this thing with other units in the army, which also make it a pretty terrible inclusion. Okay, so let's talk about the Phantasm cheese really quick, because I want to address this. This is something that caught me by surprise when I saw it on our Discord, and I want to explain to you guys how it works, because technically it does work, rules as written. So this is what happens. You move your Crimson Hunter from reserve and place it near the board edge from Strategic Reserve, just like you would with any reserve unit. You shoot the Crimson Hunter, right? Like you do. You shoot the model, and it does some damage. And then your opponent's turn comes. At the end of your opponent's movement phase, you use Phantasm on it. And because you cannot move a minimum distance of 20 inches with Phantasm, again, Phantasm is only 7 inches, as per the aircraft rules as written, your Crimson Hunter goes right back into Strategic Reserve and is essentially unkillable. Wait, what the fuck? An unkillable aircraft? Yes, you heard me correctly. The rules as written, you use Phantasm on it, and because it can't move a minimum of 20 inches, it goes straight back into reserve. And this is even backed up by the actual aircraft rule, and as far as I can tell, there's no FAQ or errata on this yet. There might be coming up, though, which would be good. I think it should be errated. I think it's one of those things in the game that's obviously a rules loophole and needs to be eliminated. But basically, this is how it works, right? So the rule states each time an aircraft model makes a normal move, first move the model straight forward, and it must move a minimum of 20 inches. All parts of the model's base must end the move at least this far from where they started. Okay, period. And that period is going to be important later. After it is moved, it can pivot on the spot 90 degrees. This does not contribute to how far the model moves. If when making a normal move, any part of an aircraft's base crosses the edge of the battlefield, or, there's a comma and it says or, it cannot move a minimum of 20 inches, that model's move ends and it is placed into strategic reserves. Okay, so remember that Phantasm, A, counts as a normal move, so that means this is a legal thing to target with it, right? You can make normal moves with this thing. And because when you make that normal move, you don't get the full 20 inches, it's only 7 inches, your model immediately goes back into strategic reserve. So yeah, basically, because it cannot move a minimum of 20, it goes back into reserve. However, many of you might have noticed when I said, remember that period, that's going to be important. So that's because the first sentence seems to contradict this, saying it must move a minimum of 20 inches, implying that you are ineligible to make moves less than that. But here's the thing about implications, interpretations, and Warhammer 40k players. Most competitive Warhammer 40k players do not go based on rules as interpreted. They go based on rules as written. So unfortunately, even though it seems like GW intended for you never to be able to move this less than 20 inches, and if you couldn't move it less than 20 inches, then it could not move unless it was moving off of the battlefield, or unless your opponent had some sort of tricky way to block your movement to where you couldn't even move at all, which has happened in the past. People were able to kill flyers by preventing them from moving and having their base touch the actual board. A move less than 20 inches would probably not be possible unless you are moving off the board, or if you're landing on some sort of impassable terrain where you can't actually have your base, in which case the model would go back in reserve. This is a fail-safe in case the model gets into a tricky situation, and in that case, you just go right back into reserve. That's basically what GW intended. However, that's not really what's written here. So currently, as it's written, the Crimson Hunter can be unkillable. Unless your opponent can do something to fuck with Phantasm and make it harder for you to, actually use that stratagem for one command point, the Crimson Hunter will remain in reserve basically the entire game after shooting, which means it's unkillable and it's dealing damage every single turn. However, players beware. This can be interpreted in slightly different ways by tournament organizers or judges, so don't rely on it. The reason being is if you are at a tournament and you don't get this cleared beforehand and you call a judge over, or your opponent calls a judge over, because let's be real, this is a really cheesy thing, and you will get a judge called on you for this. In most cases, unless the player's cool and doesn't really care, if you're going against someone really competitive or who finds this kind of suspect, they will call a judge over, and the judge will read the first sentence. And the first sentence says, right, each time an aircraft model makes a normal move, first move the model straight forward and it must move a minimum of 20 inches. Right there, they might stop reading after that first sentence and just tell you simply, nope, you can't do it because you need to make a minimum move of 20 inches. And that's it, right? You're done. The judge makes the ruling, you can't do the ability, and the whole strategy you planned your list around is now shit. It's kaput. You basically can't do it, and you're stuck with the Crimson Hunter. Also, on a side note, it's just really super fucking cheesy, right? And I mean that, and it's not like a broken or OP model or anything like that. It's not like the Wraith Knight, where if you take 2 of those, you're considered a bad guy for playing in casual games. That's not really what I'm talking about here. The Crimson Hunter isn't broken in and of itself, but the actual ruling, the way you're using the rules is cheesy. And it's using a loophole that was clearly not intended. And yeah, if you're a competitive player, you can definitely use this and you can definitely get some mileage out of your Crimson Hunter. Because Isha knows that the Crimson Hunter is not great otherwise. But if you're playing in a casual game and you try to pull this on somebody, it just feels bad, right? I, for one, probably won't use it. I definitely won't, because of the fact that, well, quite simply, it's cheese, right? It's using a rules loophole to basically make a model unkillable. And there is nothing in the game that is unkillable and can also do damage every turn. Some of you might argue that certain units are so tough they might as well be unkillable, but that's not the same thing. If you can't target something at all throughout the game, that's a little bit different than just having something that's really tough. So use this at your own discretion. It is possible. You can do it, rules as written. No one can really argue with you on that, except that it's just kind of cheesy. Okay, so enough of that. What is the role of Crimson Hunters in an Eldar army and how to make the most out of them? So the cheese aside, let's not even discuss the cheese. Obviously with the cheese, the role is it just never dies and it does consistent damage throughout the game. I think everybody can agree on that. But without the cheese, Crimson Hunters are an anti-fly unit effective at destroying tougher targets with the fly keyword and not just other flyers. So things like wave serpents, falcons, raiders, venoms, anything that's a skimmer, this thing is effective against. Especially against other Eldar players, because other Eldar players have, wave serpents and falcons and fire prisms, and this thing happens to be very good at killing those models. Flying vehicles, monsters, and mounted units are its primary targets, as +1 to hit and wound make it pretty efficient at killing them. So this thing coming in on a flank, targeting a fire prism will kill it, basically in one turn. You have 2 Bright Lances with unparalleled mastery. You can boost it with a Fate Dice damage roll if you want to. But it doesn't really need it because those 3 Pulse Laser shots are going to be hitting on 2+, wounding on 3+, and doing d6 damage apiece. The Fire Prism's only going to get a 5+ armor save against that and a 6+ against the 2 Bright Lance shots. So chances are you can kill a Fire Prism in one turn with this thing. Sadly, it is very fragile and it's very hard to hide. So once you come in and kill that 150-point Fire Prism, or 170-point Night Spinner, or whatever you target, this thing is going to die immediately because it cannot hide. So unless you use the Phantasm cheese, God, I said I wouldn't mention that, but here we are talking about it again. So unless you use that cheese, your Crimson Hunter is going to die a horrible death. Which is obviously the main reason that people don't take it. Yes, it's expensive, but if it was good and it could survive easily, like if it had an ability for a once per game 2+ invul save, like aerial maneuvers or something like that, I think people would still take this thing. But because it's basically automatically dead when it comes in, after it shoots, it's just too many points for a once and done unit. I mean, let's be real here for a second. People don't like running fire dragons at 85 points because they're a sacrificial unit. They kill something and then they die. So spending 160 points on something that is going to kill something and then die is probably not an interesting proposition for most Eldar players. Alright, so in conclusion, Crimson Hunters are effective at killing tougher units with fly, but also have quite a few unfortunate drawbacks. They are also pretty expensive at 160 points, have no objective control, are super fragile, and almost impossible to hide unless there's some crazy table with massive skyscrapers on it. Your Crimson Hunter is just not going to live. So unless you're using the Phantasm cheese, you will rarely get more than one turn of shooting out of it, which is unfortunate. I think, and this isn't just an Eldar Aspect Warrior problem. A lot of you will point to the fact that, Eldar Aspect Warriors got nerfed, and of course the Crimson Hunter got nerfed too. That's not what it is. A lot of Aspect Warriors actually got stronger in some ways. You just have to look for more clever ways to use them. With the Crimson Hunter, though, I think it's because flyers got nerfed. Flyers in general are not good. And if you look at the flyers for most factions, they're pretty dog shit for the most part, right? Especially the bomber variants of flyers because they can't actually use their bombing abilities when they come in on the board. And just take a look at the poor Dark Eldar Void Reaver bomber, for example. Its Void Mine, its most awesome weapon, cannot actually be used. So somebody sees that thing on the board, the first thing they're going to do is just shoot it. And by the way, the Void Mine is extremely good. If you look at its rules, it's basically just d6 mortal wounds to units that it moved over. Like, that's pretty good, in addition to all of its weapons. But unfortunately, it's just never going to be able to use that because it has to start in reserve. And doesn't really have any way to move over enemy units when it comes in on the board the first turn. So yeah, unfortunately, it's not just an Eldar Crimson Hunter problem, it's a game problem. Most flyers in the game, especially the bomber variant flyers, are just really bad and you probably won't see them that much at all. So in comparison with other flyers and other factions, the Crimson Hunter actually doesn't look that bad. It is bad, don't get me wrong, unless you're using some sort of cheese on it. But, you know, it's not as bad as it could be. Let's just put it that way. And if you want to run a Crimson Hunter for fun in your lists, definitely do so. It is a really cool model. I'm not trying to dissuade anybody from using it. It's just not that efficiently pointed for what it does, and it's very easy to kill. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. Thank you to all my patrons and supporters who have supported the channel over the last months. Your help is greatly appreciated. If you do want to join my Patreon, there is a free trial. You can join it for free, cancel anytime, and you will have permanent access to it to be able to talk strategy, tactics, and hobbying advice with the Eldar community. And we're kind of building up quite the community. We have quite a few more members in our Discord talking about strategies and hobbying and stuff like that. So be sure to check it out if you can. Also, if you're looking for some Eldar-inspired apparel, check out the channel store. It has some really cool merchandise there that's, you know, Eldar-inspired if you want to show off your favorite faction in your local game store. And it does go to help supporting the channel. All right, everybody, that's going to be it for today. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next video. Tomorrow, we're going to be doing our special bonus Aspect Warrior video, so stay tuned to that. I'll leave it a mystery for now. Although some of you may already know what it is if you've been paying attention in the comment section. But anyway, see you guys later. Have some great games this weekend, and peace out.